Welcome to Performance Assessment, Uniting the 4 C's in Content. This is Module 4, Performance Task Design High Overview.
So as you have had a chance to kind of look at examples of a variety of performance assessments and tasks that are out there, you're now ready to build your own. And you'll generally want to use this same 7-step process each time that you design one. The first step is to start with what is the content area learning target or targets that you want to focus on. It's helpful, to think about within which particular course or content area will this task reside, and then from there, within which unit of instruction or with which standard are you really wanting to target. And again, you certainly can target more than one content area standard in the same task if you so desire. But you need obviously at least one. And from that point, you can start to think about which of the 4 C's would you want to match with that. So creativity, critical thinking, collaboration, and communication, which of those do I want to position side by side with one or more of those content targets that I'm shooting for? And those two together will represent all of the different objectives or the different outcomes that you'll be measuring within the particular performance task. From there, it's time to start brainstorming what are all the different possible student product or performance possibilities. In other words, what might I have students do to be able to produce something that is evidence of the content area learning target and the 4 C's that you've selected. And once you know, generally speaking, what the students are going to do, you can develop a task around it, a real-world simulation. And there's an acronym that we'll teach you later in the module called GRASP to really help you make it as authentic as possible. But you'll write the prompt that you would give the students so they know what they're supposed to be doing. Once you have a prompt made, you're ready to kind of go to the back side of the assessment and think about, okay, now how am I going to score this? And so, again, there are a variety of tools like proficiency scales that you might want to use to help you design that scoring guide. But you'll create, what is it that we're going to use when students produce work to measure their mastery of the 4 C's and the content area targets that your task is aligned to. From there, you'll want to spend time finding and developing extra supplemental resources you need to administer the task. Those could be texts that students are reading or data that they're interacting with. They could be tools that they need or scaffolding tools from you that will help give them ideas around graphic organizers, things of that nature. And then finally, you would want to the extent that you're planning to use this task with other team members or other members of your school system, you'll also want to determine an implementation plan for directions for how would you administer the task so that others can understand how it works. But also so you, in thinking for yourself how you're going to do it with kids, whatever time frames you'd want to associate with the task, instructional strategies for how to accomplish certain things or for how to manage the classroom when students are engaging in certain aspects of the task. And to the extent that you want to flip the task into a digital environment, a learning management system like Blackboard or Canvas or Schoology, that would be something you'd kind of do at the very end. So again, those 7 steps really represent kind of a step-by-step process for building one of these from the ground up. We're going to take you through each of those steps in some of the additional videos associated with this module. But before we do, we want to give you kind of, again, an example that you could look at of how we went through this kind of at a high-level overview. So the example that I'll be referencing is a performance task that I designed around a math standard in a pre-algebra course, particularly the ability for students to model something with graphs. And so that was, of course, my first step, was figuring out where would I want this performance assessment to live in my math course. And I kind of determined, this was a particular unit where it seemed like it would make a lot of sense to have kids take time to use their knowledge and skills in a way that really ties to the real world. Certainly modeling with graphs, has a lot of real world associations with it. And so once I determined that, this is something that I want to do maybe at the end of that unit as a summative assessment of what students have learned in that skill, I started to think about which of the 4 C's might I want to pair with that. And as I kind of went through each of the C's, I thought about, okay, what would critical thinking look like with that skill? What would communication look like with that skill? What would collaboration look like? And what would creativity look like? And as I kind of brainstormed, what I ultimately thought is 3 of the C's fit pretty well with it, and 1 of them didn't. Creativity felt like a stretch to me, but I could totally see how students would need to use critical thinking at the same time that they were building and analyzing graphs, that they would need to think about communication in the sense that if they were going to talk about a graph, and that they would use collaboration if they were going to work together to design or analyze graphs. And so I decided that those 3 C's, alongside their ability to model with a graph mathematically, would be the 4 outcomes that I'm going to be associating with this particular performance task. From there, I started to brainstorm what might be all different things that students could do that would allow me to evaluate all 4 of those skills. So obviously I knew it was going to have something to do with designing a graph, because that's part of my math content standard. But what else would they do with that graph? You know, I thought about they could make a video where they're having to use graphics throughout it. I thought about they could be creating like an infographic. I thought about they might give some sort of oral presentation. I kind of liked that piece for the communication side of things, and also that they would work maybe as a team to put that presentation together. And certainly if the presentation was about their ability to interpret graphs that they had made, that would be an angle for me to get the critical thinking in there as well. And so I kind of landed on that idea that they would have to somehow, you know, do some research, build a graph, and then give a presentation where they use that graph to analyze a certain question. And so from there, I started to ask myself, how might I make that authentic? Where would people be doing those same types of skills and creating those same types of products or performances in real life? And again, there's a number of ways I could go with it, but my head went directly to like the business world. And I started to come up with this idea that maybe the students were going to be this business team that's been hired by a client to investigate stock data and ultimately, you know, make the case for why a client should invest in a particular stock. So again, a real world application of those skills and that kind of product that they would be creating. And so once I had that determined, I wrote the actual task prompt that students would follow. And so what I wrote was, you're a member of a 4-person business firm that's been hired by a wealthy client to help her determine the best stocks to invest in on the stock market in order to make the most profit over the coming year. Use the Student Stock Trader app. Your team will research 5 different self-selected companies on the stock market, create a graph that models the change in stock prices for each company over the past 12 months, and use the graph to give a short 5-minute oral presentation to your client, advising which of the stocks you researched would make the best investment. And so with that prompt, again, it paints a clear picture of what students are supposed to do and kind of the real world scenario around it, why it's important. At that point, I was ready to build my scoring guide. And so I used the graphic to the left as an example of a proficiency scale, which is a tool that helped me determine, you know, what does it mean to meet that learning target of modeling with graphs. In this case, for my course, it meant that students could create a graph that models the relationship between 2 variables. So I used that as the piece of my scoring rubric where the students would be meeting the standard. And then I used the other aspects of the proficiency scale to determine what would it mean for students to not meet or partially meet or exceed a particular standard. And again, I used similar proficiency scales for each of the 4 C's so that I could determine what would it mean to be meeting the standard on level for critical thinking, for communication and collaboration, and I built a scoring guide from there. At that point, I was ready. I had most of what I needed for students to be able to do the task, but certainly there were some supplemental resources that would be helpful. In the case of my example, giving them maybe some resources around or tutorials around how do you download the Student Stock Trader app. I made a short little video that showed them how to use it. I gave them some resources on, how do you give a business pitch, since that wasn't something we necessarily normally would cover in a math class. That's some of the supplemental resources I put together. And then in terms of determining an implementation plan, I decided that this would be a summative assessment I'd want to give at the end of my unit. I had to think through how would I put students in groups to work together, how would I score the collaboration aspect throughout their working process versus how would I score their presentations at the end. Do I want to video record those? So thinking through things like that to then create an ultimate plan so that I'd be successful in doing this. So again, that's just an example of how one individual used this same 7-step process to build a performance task, in this case, in a middle school math classroom. But you could go through the same process yourself and make changes depending on your content area and your purposes. To help you with that, we've also developed a task template that you can use that really organizes your thinking around these steps, and that makes it really easy and user-friendly to give to other team members in case they'd like it as well. So we'll refer back to this document in some of the future videos so you can kind of see the connection between those steps and this tool.